and it will turn out to be a very useful tool to elevate the debate of ufology and have everybody working off the same page.
Welcome to another episode of Red Dawn Shades. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and today is July 12th, 2011, and this is episode 516. More about this program and the guests that have provided us with such fascinating conversations can be found on our website, www.exogenynetwork.com. The Dawn of Shades always tries to bring interesting people right to the audience to hear about both new and old ideas. We focus on the people, places, and ideas that don't always get to make the mainstream news, the kinds of things that are frequently labeled as alternative or paranormal. For the show tonight, if you would like to have a question asked, you can email me at gscott@exogenynetwork.com. You can also send it through the virtual auditorium on Paltalk by text. I do monitor the email during the program, so if you're listening outside of the virtual auditorium and would like to have that question answered, go ahead and email it to me, and I'll get it asked for you. In the virtual auditorium, just put it into text. I'll try and catch it as the screen scrolls. And if I don't catch it the first time, feel free to repeat it again. For those of you who are listening in on a podcast, you can go ahead and email me with your questions as well. I'll try and get them answered for you. Now, for the listeners who would like to call in and ask your question over the air, you can call us at 504-273-7379. That number is our call-in number, and once again, it's 504-273-7379. For those of you who like to feel connected, you can find me on Facebook and Twitter, so you can link to me there. There's also a Dawn of Shades fan page on Facebook, so you can look for that too. For the readers, campers, foodies, cyclists, check out the articles and blogs. You might find some material that just might interest you. Before we start on the program tonight, I would like to wish my mother a very happy birthday today. And even though we couldn't spend the day together, she's been on my mind even after we got off the phone. She's a very special lady. As a child, she was probably the most encouraging of my creativity and originality of anyone I ever encountered. So I can say without a doubt, she's the person that's probably contributed the most to my speaking with you all tonight. And I also wanted to wish a belated happy birthday to John Anthony West and send out some congratulations to John and Elizabeth Jenkins for their recent wedding, and that I wish both of them the absolute best life can offer. Now, tonight's guest has visited with us before, but it is also the big season for hunting Bigfoot right now, and people are much more likely to have close encounters than any other time of year. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Matt Pruitt to the program tonight. Matt, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself to the audience?
Absolutely. I'm a field researcher, investigator, and expedition organizer for a group called the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. I've been affiliated with them since late 2006, early 2007, and have conducted active field research all over the country, primarily in the Southeast for many years, and then I lived in the Pacific Northwest for the last 2.5 years, and I currently live in Oklahoma, and I'm in the Mid-America region conducting research.
So, most of us, when we think of Bigfoot, Oklahoma is not the first state that comes to mind. Has there been a number of reported sightings there?
Absolutely. In many parts of the state, too, which is kind of surprising. I think for locals, they're very aware of the activity that happens in the southeastern part of the state, in the Ouachita Mountains and the Kiamichi Mountains, but truthfully, there's very, very good stuff that happens all over the state. We get amazing reports oftentimes accompanied with tracks, or there was a very incredible piece of footage that was obtained a few years ago that a few people saw, a handprint on a vehicle right from central Oklahoma. We get very, very good reports, say half an hour to 45 minutes in any direction of Oklahoma City. And believe me, when I first moved here and saw the place, it didn't strike me as Bigfoot habitat. You know, I lived in the southern Appalachians, and I did a lot of field research in the Appalachians for a long time. And then again, you know, I've been to places in the Rockies and the Uinta Mountains and the Sierra Mountains and the Cascades, the Olympics. So coming here, some of it's very flat and not very heavily forested. I thought, no way, but I've really got to know a lot of very good investigators here and a lot of incredible witnesses that are you know, have some good things to back up. They're not just stories. You know, there's a lot of really good tangible data that comes out of these areas too. So it's been interesting to find the consistencies and to find the things that make this place and the inhabitants unique and kind of weave that into the fabric of what kind of the matrix of the understanding about what these things are and how they operate.
Now, you know, when you're looking for Bigfoot, I know you catch a lot of ridicule. I mean, people have got to razz you.
You know, I'm lucky I don't. I mean, occasionally the uninitiated will, but usually, I mean, I've been doing it for years, and I've been talking about it. I've been very active publicly for years. I've done, you know, a number of public speeches and lectures and seminars, and I've done tracking courses, and, you know, I've led big public expeditions many times for the BFRO, and so I think that, you know, my ability to speak about it has just been kind of streamlined over the years in terms of, you know, a lot of people talk about their arguments as to why these things exist, et cetera. Mine are just so narrow and streamlined. I can usually shut people down pretty quickly because most people who do ridicule the subject have no point of reference. They don't know anything about it, and they usually don't know very much about the natural world or the history of science, and so it's really kind of easy to deflect and bob and weave past people's, you know, thinly veiled arguments and get to, you know, deliver them some real information, some real data, and people turn around pretty quickly. But these days, it seems more people are fascinated. You know, 10 years ago, yeah, people were very dismissive, but, you know, there's just been this uprising of television shows, and it's, I mean, that's a huge part of it. The documentary series on multiple channels over the years, you know, various documentaries have really shown people that, yeah, there's something to this, and it's not just the idea that there's one individual Bigfoot that's running around the country that's seemingly, you know, immortal and appears everywhere. You know, people are starting to now realize that, no, there's people claim to see a population of these things, and no matter how many times, you know, the media says it's a hoax, people don't stop seeing them. I mean, this will continue to happen. People will continue to report these things. So luckily I don't get razzed too much.
Well, that's a good thing. Well, you know, as a point of reference, I know that the common thing is how people say, how could anything so large go undiscovered for so long? Why don't we have one, you know, to examine in a zoo? But I want to throw out some facts for people. Yellowstone National Park is well known to every American and most people in foreign countries as well. It's the first national park in the United States, and I believe possibly the first worldwide national park. So it's got a long history. Millions of people visit it every single year. About 10 years ago, they had charted 15 waterfalls in the national park there. Now, they have been actively seeking out waterfalls, and now there are well over 100. I forget the exact number. I just recently watched a documentary about it. Now, waterfalls don't move. They are fairly easy to identify. You can't misidentify a waterfall. And, you know, the criteria is fairly simple. The water has to fall more than 15 feet. They found all these waterfalls. Waterfalls, like I said, they don't move around. They don't try to hide, and they're over 15 foot tall. And we just discovered over 100 of them in Yellowstone National Park. So when you compare that to a creature that is intelligent and can move around in nature, I guess it becomes a lot more plausible as to why we have never captured one.
Well, no one's ever tried to capture one. I mean, and that's, people have gone out with guns in very few numbers. You know, it's, for example, the first funded expeditions for Bigfoot research were conducted in the 50s and 60s. They were financed by a guy named Tom Slick, who was an oil millionaire, you know, no pun intended. And he had a fascination with a lot of kind of anthropological things, one of which being the abominable snowman, the Yeti in Asia, and then the Sasquatch, Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest. And he funded a small group of guys, and by small I mean, you know, less than a dozen. I think there's about half a dozen, with guns. And they basically, you know, walked these roads, rode up and down forest roads, and they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know where to begin to look for these animals, and most people don't. And so when people say, well, why haven't we captured one alive? No one's ever tried this. I mean, really tried. Certainly there's people who go out with flashlights and maybe, you know, sedatives in a jug to try to bait one. But in terms of like a real scientific organization making a concerted, planned, legitimate effort, never happened. And I don't know that it will, because the logistics are just incredible of trying to capture one of these things alive. But in terms of, you know, it'd be one thing if you said, well, how are these things so undiscovered? You know, it'd be different if I were claiming that they existed and it was just me alone. But in my mind, I mean, to many of us, they've been discovered, you know, beyond, they're beyond discovery. I mean, people have found hundreds and hundreds of tracks. There are thousands of eyewitnesses, you know, tens of thousands of eyewitnesses and tens of thousands of witnesses who have heard the sounds they make or seen the sign they leave behind, or who know someone who's seen one. You know, there are bits of film, there are bits of audio, there are fingerprints, there are footprints, there are hair samples, there are tissue samples, there are vocalizations have been recorded. So it's not like they're living in a vacuum. I mean, many, many people are encountering these things and talking about it, and a lot of them are now documenting these things. And yeah, we're still learning, and no one's got, you know, hours of HD daylight footage of these things, but most Americans, you know, who are wildlife enthusiasts don't have hours of footage of any rare animals. You know, most lay people, you know, normal people who are outdoor savvy are not going to go out and get hours of footage or even minutes of footage of a cougar on any given day. And, you know, in Washington State, there's about 5,000 cougars, and I spent a lot of time in the field out there. I lived there for 2.5 years. And I never saw a single one. I saw a lot of tracks. And I would say, you know, I'd be generous to say that there's maybe 50 Sasquatches in Washington State. So if I can't see a rare, elusive, nocturnal, solitary animal of which there are 5,000, what are the odds that I'll see one of which there's significantly less? So, but in terms of, you know, I do think, in a way, you know, a lot of us treat it as something that has, in fact, been discovered, but maybe not acknowledged by certain institutions, certain academic institutions or governmental institutions, but in my mind, they've certainly, you know, people know a lot about them.
Now, one question coming from the virtual auditorium is how do they maintain a viable gene pool with such low numbers?
Well, I never said I think they have low numbers. You know, I think they have very, very impressive numbers, you know, if you look at the whole continent. But they have very long lives, obviously. I mean, most large primates do. And they probably have very large home ranges and territories that would overlap other individuals. And, you know, there's a lot of speculation in a good deal of this, but, for example, the vocalizations that we hear and the vocalizations that we use to elicit responses, I think that's part of their kind of inherent hardwired system of locating potential mates. And I think they probably have to probe very, very large territories for a very long time to find another of their kind. But certainly in some places they'd have a higher concentration than in others, just like black bears. In some places bears have very, very large territories, and they're, you know, they barely overlap other territories. And then you have places like North Georgia where there's an average of 1 bear per square mile of national forest, which is a pretty big population. These animals would be no different. But, you know, I do think that there are enough of them, obviously, to maintain a viable breeding population. And I think their numbers for the past 100 years have probably been on the incline due to the effects that we've had on the environment. You know, there's this really kind of backwards myth that we're destroying the forest and we're destroying their habitat and we're going to kill these things and they're going to go endangered because of human encroachment. But a lot of the things that we do actually make the environment richer. And, I don't agree with many logging practices, and I'm pretty much, I'm in my own way an environmentalist because I'm trying to get the species recognized and protected, and trying to get land set aside, protected for these things. But if you look at, like, the Southeast, for example, all of the southern Appalachians have been logged, and sometimes more than once. I mean, you go in North Georgia, the luscious, greenest forests there, and that was all gone, and sometimes more than once. Sometimes it was logged and grew back and was logged again. So you have the secondary and third or tertiary growth. There are 4 times more deer there now than there ever have been, and that's because the forest is thicker, it provides more cover, there's more forage, there's more browse. And you see the same thing in parts of the Northwest where elk populations grow and black-tailed deer populations grow. These animals are benefiting from that. And so animals that prey upon and survive on those creatures, animals like Sasquatches who do hunt deer and elk and moose and wild pigs and, whatever kind of the dominant hooved animal is, the dominant protein source, I think they're benefiting from that. And the fact that there's more cover and more, it's denser forest, it's actually richer. So there's just this idea that they couldn't maintain a breeding population and that we're destroying their habitat is absolutely wrong. I mean, nowadays people are living more in urban areas than suburban areas. People are moving away from these places. There's fewer people in the woods, I would say, like living on the edge of these forests than there ever have been, at least in certain places, and I've seen that firsthand. So.
Well, sitting and thinking about Bigfoot, obviously a big part of their issues with range and whatnot consists of basically where they're finding their calories. Are they likely to, say, fields that are on the edge of forested areas, take food from farmers' fields and whatnot?
Absolutely. And, that's one thing that I've really been focusing on more than anything in the last 2 years of my personal study and field work is kind of the relationship. Sasquatches seem to, in my opinion, occur in greater numbers in terms of ecotone where human habitation meets forested areas. And I'm basing that on there's a lot of factors. Reports obviously are going to come more from there because there are more people there. I mean, to have a report, you have to have a human observer. So you're going to get more reports from where there are more humans, obviously. But in my own experience is being able to find and reliably locate, track, and sign, and to reliably encounter the animals, it happens more readily in those zones than it does when you insert yourself in like the most desolate interior wilderness, 20 miles down the dirt road in the national forest. And the reason is there's more food in those places. There's more food on the edge of human habitation. And I'm very convinced that they hang around certain places, at least in certain times of year, like heavily used recreation areas that are in national forests. Researchers always say, oh, well, I'm not going to go out this weekend because it's Labor Day and the woods are just full of people, and so the Sasquatches are all going to go hide. And I think the opposite. I think these things have been habituated over decades and decades in these places that a few times a year, the woods are full of people, and those people are pretty easy to spot because they're driving in and out of their vehicles, and they're slamming doors and lighting fires and partying and yelling and screaming and cooking food, and, anything around would figure out there's people there. And then come Sunday night, or Monday night, when you got to go back to work the next day, all these people mysteriously vanish in the forests. And what are you left with? You're left with these quiet places that are empty with trash bins and fire pits and food waste everywhere. And more food waste than a family of Sasquatches can eat in a month. And, carbohydrate-rich food waste, sugar-rich, starch-rich, protein-rich, fat-rich. So I do think that we will see in the future this really strong relationship between them exploiting human food resources. Now, it honestly doesn't happen everywhere all the time, or else we'd know a lot more about it, but I do think in certain places that plays a huge part into their their diet and their ecology. And then again, it's a better use of their stealth and cunning than to just be in the middle of nowhere being sneaky, where there's not many people, as opposed to like hanging out on the edge of human habitation and exploiting this food waste without people ever knowing it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I was curious, I've never heard of them taking livestock, but farmers are going to assume that it's a more common predator if they do have livestock taken, is my guess.
Well,
have you ever heard of it being...
There's a few anecdotal reports, like I've heard stories of them taking pigs. There was a series of events that happened in Paulding County, Georgia, that I investigated, where there was at least one large male moving through an area that many people encountered. I mean, we got a rash of reports out of nowhere, people completely unconnected that didn't know each other, but along the same creek route where this thing basically moved along through some kind of rural subdivisions and encountered a lot of people as it did. It was very large, very aggressive. We found and photographed tracks. It was really kind of one of the more documented cases, and it was solely because we had a lot of people in the area who were willing to talk about these things. And it did pass right by this alpaca farm, and this guy lost 2 or 3 alpacas, and none of his fence lines were down or broken, and the things couldn't jump over them. And he was kind of befuddled as how did this happen? And so it kind of makes you wonder. But I do think that there seems to be this very, very, very non-confrontational stance with Sasquatches and humans. They don't openly confront humans. They don't seem to like to incite the retribution of humans. And so it may be a conscious effort on their part to not disturb human livestock regularly. If they made a habit out of, it's just like anywhere, where there's wolves or coyotes or cougars or bears that get habituated to taking livestock, hunters find them and shoot them, or farmers defend their livestock and killing things. I mean, it's very, very common. It has been for 100, 200 years, who knows how long. But I do think that these things would have figured that out. They'd be smart enough to know that it wasn't wise. It's wiser to just kind of get away with basically living off the land with humans and not alerting humans to that.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Another thing that I've heard passed on as a, anecdote is that they kill dogs.
They do show a lot of defense mechanism to aggressive dogs. They don't seek out dogs or, chase down dogs, but dogs are man's, first alert system and first line of defense, and have been for who knows how many thousands of years that we've been domesticating wolves and creating dogs, etc. All the reports where they show violence to dogs that I'm aware of is a dog pursuing them, chasing them. And it's usually in the context of, defending their owner. Like someone goes out and they're out hunting with the dog. Usually they don't really attack hunting dogs because hunting dogs run away from these things and refuse to track them. But at like campsites or homesteads or et cetera, when dogs are alerted to them and they're barking, and they go out after the thing, very often they're injured. And I know of, a couple dozen stories of them killing dogs, and there are more stories of them, swatting away dogs and dogs running back and cowering, or dogs showing like extreme fear, like an unreasonable amount of fear when these things are just even around, not even in an open confrontation, but when they're moving around the woods. And so we often wonder if there is some kind of subtle odor or pheromone that they give off that puts other animals on high alert, that there's an apex predator around. So, but yeah, they don't seem to like dogs for that reason.
Well, I was kind of curious. A couple of times when I've been out camping, and we have heard some sounds that we suspected could possibly be a Bigfoot lurking in the area somewhere. Have also coincided with my big dog spending a lot of time staring off into the woods at things we can't see with a low rumbling growl. She wasn't afraid, but she also showed no interest in producing a big show of aggression. It was a very subtle signal that she was sending. There again, she didn't move to the edge of camp even. She stayed right where she was, but she'd be watching and periodically would give a low growl, which is a little unnerving, especially when you don't, you may not have heard anything in that area she's staring at right now. And, there again, your dog is your first alert system. And so I was just kind of curious because, that's unusual behavior for her. She's not apt to take off and chase something and leave me behind, but for her to move to camp barking or growling, pulling on some sort of aggressive show would not be unusual at all, especially in more remote camps. And,
yeah, they seem to really,
different.
Sasquatches seem to really hang back and avoid, and we've seen that, in other witness reports and in our own outings, and that's why, personally, most of us don't allow dogs when we're out conducting field research, because, and the analogy I use is, if you are like a rebel tribe, or let's say that you're a band of, Navy SEALs that are hiding out from the enemy, and your job is to maybe gather some intelligence about what these guys are doing in your turf, and you sneak up at night, you're going to feel pretty confident and be able to get pretty close and kind of satiate some of that curiosity if there's a group of humans around a campfire and the fire's crackling and they're talking amongst each other and staring in the fire, doing the things that people do. But if they have a dog with them, every time you move, that dog's ears perk up and its head turns and looks right at you, and if the wind blows the wrong way, you see that dog's nose picking up and looking in your direction, you're going to hang back because you don't want that dog to alert its owners that you're there. And so I think Sasquatches have figured out, that dogs are the early alert system, and you probably diminish your chances of hearing something, or at least having something come very close by when you have dogs around.
So in my case, if I don't want to have a really close encounter, having my dog along is a good thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, very few. People have close encounters, but it's very, very rare. Of the millions of people that camp every year, only a few, have these kind of camp visitors, so to speak. So it's not really a concern, because we're out there, we're trying very, very hard to elicit those approaches, and even that is very difficult. But yeah, I tell people if you're really worried about it, bring one or more dogs and have a bunch of lights around it. There's nothing.
Well, I have to admit, usually when I go camping these days, I have 3 dogs with me, ranging from a 5-pound Chihuahua to a 65-pound, now getting old red dog. And then Sissy in the middle is what we call the Yapatron 3000, which tells you what she does most of her time. She's just a continual yapper. She doesn't even have to see anything. She lives in her vision, and I think that's part of the reason she barks all the time anymore. But, you do kind of wonder, because I've had a couple of incidents, on particular trips where we had the growling stuff going on, where at night small debris kept hitting the side of the tent, and there was no wind blowing. Just little peculiar things. And, there again, Red has been trained from the time she was a pup that inside the tent she's to never make a sound. And that was due to a skunk when she was a puppy, actually. That's why that rule has been staunch all along. She doesn't make a sound inside the tent. The most she's going to do is pick up her head and look in the direction of whatever is concerning her. So unless I can see her ears in the tent, I don't even know what she's looking at. I know she's looking at something because I'm hearing it too. But, she's much better at hearing than I am. And, I have wondered, why she would do those kinds of things, whether it was, a raccoon or whatever, and did I find any sign the next day that said A or nay? No. I didn't find any sign of an animal I knew, but I didn't find any footprints, and I wasn't going to because of how deep the duff was in the area. You're just not going to find much of anything unless somebody tries to leave you a sign. It's just not going to happen. But a lot of people are in that situation. They have something going on during the night, especially if you're a novice camper. I've been woke up, but they're surrounding us, and you're like, what? I mean, what's surrounding us? I mean, we were camping in Arizona at the time, and by the time I was awake and figuring out what the threat was, the threat turned out to be just 2 coyotes, probably 5 miles or further away. Nobody was surrounding us. We weren't in any danger. It wasn't a pack of anything. And a lot of times they do have a very logical explanation. Or the first time you hear an elk bugle, it can be a pretty eerie sound, or a cougar screech. I mean, the hair in the back of your neck is going to come up. That sound will never be forgotten. You know, those sounds can be very, very frightening to novice campers. So do you think that contributes to, you might say, unwarranted reports or unsubstantiated reports?
In certain places, absolutely. And, for example, in North Georgia, there's not a whole lot of awareness. I mean, there are people who know that people see things, but it's not a part of the social culture. So it's people hear things, and I think the inverse happens, where I think people probably hear Sasquatches and think it's a normal animal, and they just write it off. You know, they hear movement, or they hear distant vocalization, et cetera, et cetera. They don't think much about it. Whereas in the Northwest, we get so many unwarranted reports because Bigfoot is such a part of the social culture, and it's woven in the fabric of Northwestern life. And so people that are aware of that and who are open to the possibility, they'll ascribe, like, you know, every bump in the night and broken stick and howl and hoot and, you know, footfall, everything's Bigfoot. So yeah, it certainly causes a lot of unwarranted reports. But in other places, you know, like North Georgia, people say, oh, you know, there's no such thing. They don't exist. And then I'll play them some vocalizations that we have that, you know, we're very convinced are Sasquatch vocalizations. And people go, oh, yeah, I've heard that. So what did you think that was? And they'll say, oh, I didn't know, but I've heard that sound more than once. And so because they don't have, you know, a list in their minds, Bigfoot's not on that list. And when they hear a sound, they go, what could that possibly be? No, panther? No. Bear? No. Cow? No, there's no cows out here in these mountains. You know, horse? No, they don't make that sound. They go through this list in their mind. Sasquatch just simply aren't on that list. It's write it off.
Yeah, and I can understand that. And the woods are incredibly noisy places. Everybody says, oh, you go out to the woods for peace and quiet. I suffer from insomnia, and it happens in camp just as much as it does at home. And my last camping trip, I got up at 3:30. Well, you know, for anybody who's ever gone primitive camping, when you wake up at 3:30, do you know what you do until dawn? You sit there and you wait for dawn to come. There's nothing else to do. You can't do anything. So you sit there and you listen. And you may have a fire going, and you may not. You know, I didn't bother lighting a lantern. I don't even remember. I don't think there was even a fire going. And that was mostly because it was really hot. The woods are incredibly noisy at night. It gets quiet once the sun comes up. But at night, everything is making a racket. There's 100 different kinds of frogs and insects and birds all calling back and forth. I can hear the whippoorwills moving around, you know, and calling back and forth. You hear the cranes coming, you know, getting ready to boogie out for the day, and so forth and so on. It's noisy. You know, so where can you go to hear are there recordings of Bigfoot vocalizations available online?
Yeah, on our website, as a matter of fact, at bfro.net. There's quite a few, and we're going to be expanding that. There's more and more and more that are coming in. You know, people hear things more often than anything, just because it's easier to hear something than it is to see it. You know, because sound carries such a great distance, and you know, I've heard vocalizations myself in many places in the country, and recorded some myself, and so that's kind of still a very difficult task, and it's a rare occurrence, but that's easier to do than, you know, seeing one of these animals. So, yeah, there are some very good examples. The best of which, in my opinion, is a howl that was recorded in 1994 in Columbiana County, Ohio, by BFRO director Matt Moneymaker. That howl, it's been studied by a few different bioacoustics experts who have all kind of unanimously agreed that it's being generated by a living animal. It's not mechanical. It's not a human. It doesn't seem to be any other known mammal vocalization of this or any other continent. and it's the most consistent with what people describe. And so it's been recorded a few times. Matt was the first person to record that sound in Ohio in '94. One of our investigators was able to record a Sasquatch making that same type of call in Mississippi. Recently, one of our guys recorded Sasquatches making that same sound in southern Washington. And there is one from North Georgia that unfortunately has not been released yet. I'm kind of currently working with the gentleman who recorded those sounds, and he's a little bit, I think, reticent to be attached to this subject, so he's not saying that that's what he thinks it is or not, but I'm very convinced because it's the same sound. I've also heard that sound myself in many places and in response to other emulated Sasquatch calls. So I am convinced that that's a sound that they make, and that if you make certain sounds like them, oftentimes they'll make sounds back, and that's one of them. And I've heard that howl in Georgia. I've heard it in North Carolina. I've heard it in Washington. I've heard it in Oregon. So I'm convinced that they do make those sounds.
That makes a lot of sense then. Now, I've got a bunch of questions coming in from the virtual auditorium, so we're going to hit those real quick. Are Bigfoot or Sasquatch found in Europe?
You know, they're not. And I think if there's a lot of kind of this historical idea of the wild man that's really kind of fascinating. Like, you see a lot of this kind of depicted in older art, like medieval art, et cetera, of these hair-covered, tall beings. And so maybe at one point in time, their radiation, you know, they were in that part of the world. These things seem to radiate out of Asia. There's different parts of the world where people see mystery hominids, you know, and like in Russia and Australia, et cetera. But the ones that are described identically to the North American Sasquatch occur in parts of China, Vietnam, India, Malaysia, etc. So we think that they are actually have a radiation out of Asia, making them some kind of Asian species, whether that's, you know, a Memwood ape line, the same line that gave rise to the orangutan and Gigantopithecus. That's a huge possibility. I wouldn't be surprised if they were sounds to be another genus or another species of the genus Homo, like we are. Homo erectus was an Asian, you know, primarily Asian species. So I don't. You know, I do believe that whatever they are, they came into North America across Beringia from Asia, and maybe at one time they were as far as that part of the world. But no, we don't get any reports that are reliable from Europe. You know, there's one or two every few decades where they're here. You know, it's hundreds and hundreds each year, and so I think if they did exist there, people would see them more often, and there'd be more awareness. People would find tracks, et cetera.
So you said, you know, Asia and Africa and North America. How about South America and Africa?
Well, not Africa. I mean, people, they describe other mystery animals there, and there are some in parts of South America. So I do think it's possible that they could have gone very far south. You know, Patagonia means Bigfoot, and it was named that because some of the first explorers that landed on those beaches there claimed to see these giant footprints along the beaches and rivers. And then there's this, they call it the Mapingari or the Maracoxy. And so there are stories in South America of a Sasquatch-like mystery animal, you know, 8 to 10 feet tall, nocturnal, et cetera. The best information about that I'm aware of was in Ivan T. Sanderson's work, and he published a book in the early 60s called Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life, and he talked about, you know, these mystery hominids that occur on all these different continents. But I don't think many people have taken it very far in terms of, you know, in North America is really the epicenter because people have applied so much time and money and effort into studying these things and learning about them and sharing information. You know, I've never heard of any efforts to study these things in Central or South America. There's very, very minimal efforts in Asia. You know, there's occasionally expeditions in Bhutan and, you know, in parts of China like the Shimanji Preserve, small efforts on the Johor Peninsula in Malaysia, but nothing compares to the amount of people involved in North America. You know, this network of people who are, well, most of us are sharing data. You know, there's a lot of hard-headed people, and it's kind of frustrating because not everyone gets along, and we all should because we're all in it for the same reason, I hope. But yeah, so it's possible, I think, that whatever these are, they could have made it down there. But I haven't seen enough data or heard enough data to convince me either way. but certainly Asia and North America.
You talk about people in the Bigfoot interest area being a little hard-headed. Years ago, when I was looking for Bigfoot experts, I went online into a chat room for Bigfoot enthusiasts. And, I just go in, and the first question I was asked was where I was from. And I thought, well, that's awfully nosy. But, there's sort of a smart aleck attitude to me, and where am I from? I mean, I'm not exactly, sure what they meant, but my response was my mother. Anyhow, I was probably kicked out of the room. Yeah, that wasn't a good way to answer the question. So some of them, no, they don't have much of a sense of humor. And as far as, the efforts to find Sasquatch in the United States, you see the tabloids occasionally, whatever they're called. I forget the names of them. Those papers that, have the monkey-faced boy and, whatever else they can come up with to make they'll occasionally have Bigfoot captured and shipped to Japan or China or some other place. And, seen being loaded onto a boat. Where did this kind of report, as well as the hoaxes, a couple of years ago there was a hoax in Georgia. There's been other hoaxes over the years. They do a great deal of damage to serious researchers. But how do serious researchers cope with this kind of little crap that is put out in very public places?
Well, it does and it doesn't, because if you stick to your guns and you devote, there's varying degrees of interest in this. And there's a lot of people like myself who have really kind of devoted their lives to it and do it, almost full-time, basically, in some way or another. And I think for people like us, it really doesn't derail us at all, because we're already so focused and active. But I can imagine for some people, they spend a lot of time, explaining away these hoaxes and defending the subject. And luckily, I don't really ever have to do that, because I think the social circle of people around me and people that I know very well understand that hoaxes will happen, and, it doesn't negate the reality that thousands of people see these things and that tracks have been found. And so the kind of damage that happens is when erroneous information is attached to a real event. For example, the Patterson-Gimlin film. For people to say, I was the guy in the suit. There's been many, many, many books written about that incident and documentaries and a lot of scientific inquiry study that's been supportive and, in my mind, really kind of demonstrates that this is a real living, breathing animal and the footage was not faked. But, it takes one guy to go, oh, I was the guy in the suit, and he doesn't even have to explain anything else. His claim should be studied with every bit as much, there should be just as strong an inquiry into his claim as there is to the footage itself. And so that's when things are bad, because I talk to people and they go, oh, yeah, that footage is fake. Yeah, a guy said he was in the suit. And I'll say, well, have you seen this or this or this? Because I will look into anything as far as you can look into it every time. I'll talk to the pros and the cons, and and with the Patterson film, they call it the Patterson-Gimlin film because there was another gentleman named Bob Gimlin there, and I've hung out with Bob about 5 times. I've been camping with him twice. I've spoken to a lot of dairy scientists about the film, both pro and con, proponents like Dr. Jeff Meldrum and other people who don't think it's real. I've been to the film site myself. So that's the kind of inquiry that you have to devote, to really get a handle on things. But, yeah, the only really frustrating thing is when, hoaxes are usually kind of funny. Like the guys had a Bigfoot suit stuffed with guts in a cooler, and anyone who knew anything about Bigfoot could tell immediately that it was a hoax. And, and then like recently there was a guy with a cell phone video of a Bigfoot crossing the road and waved at the car, waved at the guy taking the picture. It was so obviously a joke, But so I don't consider that damaging. It doesn't hurt us. You have to have a sense of humor about this stuff. I laugh at it all the time. It kind of is silly, and I can see why people think it's silly, and sometimes they think we're silly, and I'm completely okay with that. But I'm not okay with when erroneous information gets attached to a real event and just kind of muddies the waters. And it happens all too much lately, and people, something will happen, and then it's like a big game of telephone. And so all these kind of loudmouth braggarts who have no business being involved get online, and they start retelling their version, which is completely wrong, because their version is based on hearsay and dubious sources, and then that gets recorded on the Internet as the gospel truth. And then you have this other radiation of people reading it, going, oh, this is totally bogus. I heard the whole story, and there's no way this could be true. And it's like, well, no, you didn't hear the story. You heard a fourth-hand version from someone who didn't know what they were talking about, and this was a real event that really happened. But the facts get lost in the shuffle. So that's the more frustrating thing.
Well, logic says that, like you see in the film that you're talking about, I've seen it in a number of documentaries, clips of it. When you watch it, Bigfoot is not engineered exactly like humans. There's differences in their skeletal structure, in how their muscles are put together, in how they move, the lengths of their limbs. I'm not a scientifically trained person in those areas, but I happen to be a person that's fascinated by watching people move. I can recognize people far further away, out of my normal range of vision, by the familiarity with the pattern of their movement. So I can say, well, that's so-and-so, even though I can't see their face, but I know that's who it is because of how they move. To me, it's as distinctive as their face or their voice. And you watch that Bigfoot moving across there, and I'm like, that doesn't move right for a human. Especially a human in a suit. Because clothing doesn't move like skin. Now, even though it's fuzzy and it's distant and even blown up, it's still not real clear. It doesn't look like a suit to me. I'm not a photographic expert. I'm not a scientist. I would just say that based on my observations, that's probably not a human in a suit. But that's my opinion, and it's based on nothing more than that. We did have another question from the virtual auditorium. Excuse me. Since Bigfoot is seen in most states, are they migrating? If so, what are they following? Plant growing seasons or whatever? Are they seen more in the south during the winter than in the northern regions such as Maine?
No, they don't do these long migrations, and people very often will think that or tend to misinterpret that from the data. Everything I've seen has convinced me that they have home ranges that they stay within, and those ranges, I would venture a guess to say, and if I were to tell you why I picked this number, it'd probably take the entire last hour to explain based on a few cases. The short version would be there are cases where for many years there are repeated occurrences of recognizable individuals in terms of their footprints are very, recognizably different. And so we were able to plot the movement of those individuals. So if you took a given point on a map, a Sasquatch might not go in any direction further than, say, 15 to 18 miles from that point. Let's just say that. I'm not saying that's the gospel truth, but even if you had, and that seems like a pretty short distance, like for me, that's like if you live in Oklahoma City, you might go to Edmond, you might go down to Norman, where OU is, you might go over to El Reno, you might go, over to another town, and it seems like a very short distance, but if you're talking about 18 miles from any given point, that's about 1,000 square miles. I mean, it's a huge area, seemingly, but then again, it's not like they're going from the Poconos down to the Southern Appalachians. It just means that they occupy one little part, say maybe an area the size of a county, or that overlaps a couple of counties. Everything I've seen suggests that that's how they live, and they have territories that overlap or that come very close to other territories. And I think that it's their familiarity with that home range that makes them so successful. that it's because they understand how these places work, and that's how they're able to avoid humans. Whereas if they're migrating great distances, I mean, they would be constantly inserting themselves in environments that they knew nothing about. And so they'd be crossing roads a heck of a lot more, and they'd end up in people's backyards and subdivisions and neighborhoods, and they wouldn't know where the freshwater sources were, and they wouldn't know where the deer congregate, and they wouldn't know where the most hunters were, and they wouldn't know the safest ridge lines, again, with clean water sources. So I don't think they migrate, but in terms of a seasonal pattern, like, for example, in North Georgia, all the winter reports come from right on the edge of human habitat in these rural valley communities. And all the warm weather reports happen deep in the interiors of these mountains, like on the headwaters of certain rivers. And there's a few reasons, I think, for that. I think that obviously humans aren't going to those headwaters in the winter, so maybe the Sasquatches are still there too, but there's no people going out there to spot them. Whereas during the summer you have hikers and campers and people that are bird watchers and collecting mushrooms or other wild edibles or fishing that are putting themselves in those places to see them. But also I think that there's more food on the edge of human habitation. So in the winter, when there's no wild edibles, they have to subsist on hunting, and then I think a lot of exploiting human food waste again. So, but no, there's nothing I've ever seen to suggest that they move distances further than, I'd say like 20 to 25 miles from a given point. And even that, I think, is a very long distance. I think their home range are probably even smaller than that. But, that's something that we won't know or be able to prove for a long time. That's my own theory and speculation based on a number of cases and a lot of doing my homework in different parts of the country, and especially in what I've seen in North Georgia, because to this day, I process all the reports from North Georgia. I have a small group of people that I work with there consistently who keep me informed about a number of things from, bear activity, deer activity, all these things that we're keeping our eye on a given area. And being able to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of all the wildlife activity, including, as best we can, the Sasquatch activity. So that's why I feel that way.
Now, I realize that a lot of information about Bigfoot really isn't available at this point yet. But from what you're aware of, does Bigfoot tend to live in family groups, like a mated pair and their offspring? Or are they solitary, more like bears are, and that the offspring only stay with the mother for, a year or two, and then they're on their own? How does it seem to work? 'Cause most primates, I think, do live in family groups of some sort.
Well, there are some solitary ones, like orangutans are very solitary animals, but they tend to be very social when they're in captivity. So it's like they have the propensity to be social, but given the fact that they require a lot of their environment, they tend to be solitary in their natural state. Sasquatches, I think, probably spend a good deal of their lives being solitary. And again, I think that goes back to searching for mates, for probing a large area, leaving a territory and probing other territories in search of, a mate, which I do think takes a very long time. And I think that's why people will hear these vocalizations, through these areas night after night as the thing moves along, and occasionally people hear things vocalizing and then they hear a very distant response, which again I think they're kind of probing to find each other, etc. But I do think that when they mate or they pair, they do that for a period of time. For example, there are numerous reports. I mean, many of the personal experiences and encounters that I've had have involved two animals, Sasquatches. Individuals, whatever you choose to refer to them as. And many, many track finds are of multiple individuals, 2 to 3 individuals, sometimes 4, but it usually seems to be adult male, adult female, and a juvenile, or 2 juveniles. But most often they're seen by themselves, and I do think that, like anything, they'd probably have to spend a certain period of their life striking out on their own and trying to locate a mate and perhaps probing new territories and establishing new territories. But I think for the most part, they travel in family units, which would be like 2 to 3 individuals, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, hold on to those thoughts. Folks, it's time for us to take a break. So while we're away from your computer, check out our website at www.exogenynetwork.com. Stay tuned, and the Dawn of Shades will return with our guest, Matt Pruitt, and more about our topic tonight in just a few minutes.
The Church of Mavis radio show is now in session. Saturday night.
Welcome back to the Dawn of Shades. I'm your host, Gia Scott, with our guest, Matt Pruitt. And once again, I would like to remind everyone to visit our website, www.exogenynetwork.com. You can sign up for the newsletter, wander around, and explore the website, and let me know what you think of it. There are links to take you to blogs, Twitter, and even Facebook. If you want to go straight to the blog, you can go to giascott.wordpress.com, and you can find out what kinds of things I've been up to lately. Now, our topic tonight is definitely a fascinating one, and we're fortunate enough to have Matt Pruitt, our common sense Bigfoot hunter, joining us tonight. So if you would like to ask him a question or make a comment, please go ahead and email it to me at giascott@exogenynetwork.com, and I'll pass it on from there. If you're listening in on a podcast or think of it after the program is finished, go ahead and send it to me. I'll try my best to get your questions answered. If you're in the virtual auditorium, you can put it into text there, and I'm trying very hard to catch it as the screen scrolls. For those of you who would like to call in and ask your question, our call-in number is 504-273-7379. Now, Matt, while we were on break, we talked a little bit about the connection between Bigfoot and the paranormal aspects. So, is Bigfoot a supernatural creature or what?
I personally don't think so. In my opinion, I think they're very normal biological animals, creatures, beings, whatever you want to call them. I choose the term animals, and that's a lot of people think that's a denigrating term, and people think that they, should be called something more noble or something that denotes more, cognizance, but. We're animals too. And they're certainly not plants or minerals, so I call them animals. But, one of the things that I talk a lot about with people is the idea of observation versus interpretation. And I've been talking about it for so long, and so I recently started a blog, and it's probably if you Google Matt Pruitt, you'll find it. It's mattpruittonline.blogspot.com. But that's one of the articles I wrote was about observation versus interpretation. And the analogy I'll use, let's say, and we can talk about this connection too, or lack thereof, is a lot of UFO reports. Someone sees light in the sky, and if you go down to the very core of the observation, it would involve someone seeing lights that they didn't quite understand in the night sky. Well, some people will tell you, it's secret U.S. military craft that the government's testing because they don't like to tell us anything. And then another person will say, no, it's foreign military craft studying us, gathering intelligence for an impending attack because the world's about to collapse. And another person will say, no, it's some kind of spiritual, supernatural light phenomenon that's angels or demons. And the person will say, no, it's a craft that's being driven by an extraterrestrial being from another planet. But really, it's just lights in the sky. We don't know what it was. And the same thing happens in other phenomena that's very hard to describe and very hard to understand, like Sasquatches, because they're very rare animals and fleeting interactions, and they're very difficult to detect because they're nocturnal, and a lot of these things happen in the dark. So I do think that people have experiences that are novel or unique, or sensations that are novel and unique that happen in the context of a Sasquatch encounter that are being interpreted as paranormal. For example, most people, well, this is maybe too broad a generalization, but most ever experienced real fear, as in truly fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system fear. Most people have, am I going to pay my bills on time? Am I pretty enough? Am I smart enough? Is she going to break up with me? Am I going to get fired? Very few people have the feeling of, there's a large wild animal right there, and am I going to die tonight or not? And so people have these encounters, and they have these incredible, overwhelming sensations. And sometimes it's a fear of dread or malice, and sometimes it's extreme anxiety or nausea. And then a lot of people say, well, maybe Sasquatches can cause these feelings. And you know what? Maybe they can, maybe they can't. I don't know. But I think that there's people that are experiencing things or observing things, and their interpretations are going to be skewed based on their own personal belief system or, their culture, what they were, grown up, believing, etc. That happens in so many ways. And you have to realize that the observation is far more important than the interpretation. The other analogy I use is you have two observers. You take two people, who don't know anything about mountain gorillas, never seen them, never read about them in an encyclopedia, have no idea what they are. And you take one to the Chicago Zoo, and they get to watch a male silverback for like 2 hours through the big plexiglass. That person in that calm, open, observational environment would probably pick up on all the shared primate behaviors. Because when you watch a gorilla, it's eerie. Or any, great ape, gorilla, chimp, orangutan, you think, man, they're so human-like, the way they move their hands, the way they look around, these expressions they make, the way they kind of brush their hair. There's all these things that are human-like. And so that observer might walk away and go, man, that's the most human-like animal on the planet. And it is a kind, sentient being, and it needs to be treated as such. And then you take observer number 2 into the Virunga Mountains of Africa, where mountain gorillas live. And it's dusk, and it's getting dark, and the forest is really scary, and you smell this overpowering odor, and a silverback bluff charges you, and it's destroying vegetation and screaming, and they have these big, huge, canine teeth that are very monstrous looking, and these big gaping mouths and the conical head. And that person would say, those things are monsters, they're terrifying, it was evil, it wanted to, harm me, it was malicious. And they're both describing the exact same animal. And so that happens in Bigfoot, all the time. And it's been happening for decades. It will continue to happen until we have more data to work with. And so when I hear a lot of these kind of people attributing paranormal things, well, those are things we can't measure. We can't study that yet. If Sasquatches have the ability to do, let's say, like biomechanical processes that we don't understand, how do we even begin to measure that? And how can I set?
Yeah, that's a very great explanation of it. So essentially what you're saying is that Sasquatch or Bigfoot, whatever name you want to call it, I happen to not really like either one of them because they kind of are, I don't know, it just kind of has an air of nonchalance about it. It doesn't take it as a particularly serious thing, but I can't think of what else we could call it other than hominid X. But they're just as real and as physical as a raccoon or a bear or a mountain gorilla or an orangutan or any other animal that lives on this planet, even if they are one that we don't know very much about. Now, I do have a question that came in via email from Ocean Springs, Mississippi. And it talks about that you said something about the handprint from a Bigfoot, and they're curious about what the prints look like and how you knew that it was a Bigfoot's handprint, and what the hair, we've got a lot of questions here, what the hair also looks like. They had... we seem to have lost Matt. So hopefully the producer man is going to notice and get him back on the line with us. And we'll continue from there. And meantime, I'll just continue talking about this question that came in from Mississippi, even though I'll probably have to repeat it for Matt to even answer the question. It's difficult when our phone system glitches, but that's live radio. I sent a message to the producer man, so hopefully he will begin to pay attention. And if not, we'll have to just send him a psychic smack on the back of the head. But in the meantime, Matt Pruitt is what I call literally my common sense Bigfoot researcher. He regards this entire field as something very, very physical that he's researching in a very logical manner. He's done it for a long time. He doesn't go off on real strange tangents. He doesn't give them a lot of supernatural abilities. He seems to regard it as pretty much a very physical kind of event. In my own case, when we were camping, this is over a year ago, in Panhandle of Florida in the forest, we were primitive camping, and usually it's a small group of us that goes out. That particular weekend, it was just myself and Greg that were out there along with our dogs, and I guess it was the last night we were camping, and we were trying to get to sleep, and something kept hitting the tent. And I've camped a long time, done a lot of primitive camping, and in the meantime, I'm like, no, this is not stuff falling out of the tree. There's no wind blowing, et cetera, et cetera. And yet this stuff, it was pine needles, longleaf pine needles, which, for anybody who's not from the Southeast, longleaf pine needles are probably 8 to 12 inches long, and you can throw them almost like a little dart, for a short distance. And these pine needles kept hitting the side of the tree, or side of the tent, rather. And this went on for quite some time. There again, like I talked about earlier in the show, the dog has been trained to not bark, growl, or make any noise inside the tent. And that comes from, in campgrounds, skunks are frequent visitors to campgrounds. And you don't want your dog to kick off a skunk when you have a very thin piece of nylon between you and that scent gland. So the dog was taught not to make any sounds. And in the meantime, she just doesn't make any sound. So this goes on all night. I get up the next morning and I look around, and there's more needles than usual laying right along the perimeter of the tent, but that's it. There's no sign of someone having been out there, or any animal. But we back up our camp and whatnot. And the last thing before we left, I was walking along the creek bank where we had been camped, because we were camped right alongside a little creek. And I was probably 20 or 30 yards from camp. And I found a substantial quantity of hair caught in a number of trees in small branches in pine bark. Those little cracks and crevices in the pine bark had apparently raked across some animal, and loose hairs had been pulled out. Now, this is early spring. It was Easter weekend, as a matter of fact. And they were probably shedding. Winter shed would have been going on then. It would have been a logical thing that's been happening. Now, for some reason, rocket scientist me, I did not collect the hair samples. which I deeply regret. But I honestly thought at the time it was not Bigfoot. It was some logical explanation, something I wasn't thinking of. Now, granted, there are bears in the area, but we've not had a bear in camp, and this did not look like bear hair. I'm very familiar with horse hair. I knew hair from the mane or tail, so I really didn't know what kind of hair it was. It was too high to be a raccoon or squirrel. The branches were too small. Matt, do we have you back now?
Absolutely. I don't know what happened there. My apologies.
Yeah, well, it was just one of those quirky things, and Mr. Producer Man was away from the desk, so I'm going to have to give him a psychic smack on the back of the head for that one. But I was in the middle of telling you about a question that we got via email from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and they were inquiring about the handprint from Bigfoot, and they wanted to know what it looked like, and how did you know it was a Bigfoot handprint? And I've got some other questions in here, but we'll just go with one at a time here.
Well, there have been quite a few handprints collected from around the continent. Some of those were left in substrate that could be cast, like mud or sand or dirt. Some of those have been left on surfaces that retained those prints. One that comes to mind is in a screen window from New Mexico that was discovered by a BFRO investigator named Dennis Foll from Colorado. And I know a lot about that particular case is online to be read. There was a famous case in Fort Bragg, California, of a handprint that was left on the wall of a house, a very dirty handprint. And the particular one that I mentioned earlier, there was a series of sightings west of Oklahoma City in a small town. There was also a piece of footage there that was obtained from a security camera, and that's a whole other story. But basically, we had a lot of reason to believe that there was a very large male moving around this area. The one that was filmed and what people were reporting was a very, very large individual, over 9.5 feet tall. And at one point it approached a house, and there were some kind of abandoned or junk vehicles around the home. And it was either looking in the windows or somehow approached this house, and the guy saw it. He got spooked, and he saw the thing take off. And as it went between these two vehicles, there was, I guess, some kind of like riding lawnmower between them, and it braced itself and put its hand on the roof of one car and stepped over its vehicle, or stepped over this lawnmower between the two vehicles to get away. And there was a guy who was a biology professor at Mid-America Christian University here in Oklahoma City named Alton Higgins, who investigated that case, and the handprint was still there. Some of the oil of the hand had been transferred to the top of this vehicle, and they actually got a saw and sawed the roof of this car off. We had the permission of the owner, and it was studied by a latent fingerprint examiner named Jimmy Chilcutt. It was a very, obviously a primate hand. The proportions were much too large to be a person's. Unfortunately, it had been degraded in the sun the following day, so there wasn't a whole lot of dermal or, fingerprint data to be gathered from it, but a really fascinating case nonetheless. And in a matter of months, that animal was filmed, left a handprint, left a series of tracks that were cast and studied, and then Alton ended up seeing it in daylight as he was setting camera traps in another area. So really kind of fascinating series of events there.
Uh-huh. Okay, now the next question in this email is, what does the hair of a Bigfoot look like? The person goes on to state that in Malala, Oregon, 45 minutes outside of Portland, they found some long, black, thick hair stuck in some branches, and then she's wondering if it was Bigfoot hair.
Well, Sasquatch hair is not very thick or coarse. It's very fine. It's very much like human hair, almost like the hair on a human body, that fine. I've seen a few examples of hair that was, thought to be purported Sasquatch hair by a number of scientists, most notably Dr. Wolfgang Fehrenbach. And I'd seen some samples after he had kind of done a thorough morphology test and decided that they were indeed, they matched other hair samples that are thought to be of Sasquatches. Obviously these things haven't been proven to exist yet, and there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with that at the moment, but we have a lot of reason to believe that they are Sasquatch hair samples, and I can tell you that it's very fine. It's not very coarse. It does not typically come in clumps. It's not banded. It's not two-toned. It seems to have kind of a uniform coloring. It looks like the hair of a wild human, for lack of a better term. It's very, when people do these morphology studies, they say it's definitely primate hair. There's no medulla or spongy center mass, and it always has worn ends. It hasn't been cut, and it looks like the hair or body hair of a wild human. So if it's very thick or very coarse, it's probably not Bigfoot hair. And I can tell you in the Northwest, there's a lichen that grows called old man's beard that looks very much like hair. It's actually a plant matter.
Right. I've seen that too. Well, the hair that I found in the Florida Panhandle, which there again, for whatever reason I didn't collect the sample, it was dark brown, reddish in color, probably, I'd say about 3 inches long. It was not horse hair, it wasn't tail or mane hair, which, people who work with horses know they're different, different texture between the two. It was coarser than my hair, but it was no more coarse than human hair. However, the ends of it that I looked at, now granted I'm looking at them with reading glasses, not a microscope or anything. I used 2 pairs of reading glasses to magnify it. The end appeared to be a tapered end rather than a cut end, which said, okay, it's not people hair, because people hair would have a cut end. We typically cut our hair. So it's a blunter end, whereas a hair that is naturally terminating would be more of a tapered. So my thing was, okay, whatever this, and the hair was consistently about 3 inches long. Whatever animal I came from had hair about 3 inches long was my guess. I just couldn't figure out of what animal could leave this hair in branches, thin branches, about 4.5 feet off the ground. That was the unknown, because it was about 4.5, 5 feet, about the same height as my own head, which is the only reason I even seen it, was because as I'm moving the branches out of the way, because they were crisscrossing the trail, I saw the hair. And there was quite a bit of it caught in the branches through that little strip on that trail. There again, I just, don't know what it was. Yes, I will know better in the future. I will always collect samples just to satisfy my own curiosity. But I honestly thought that I just wasn't thinking of the correct animal. The only animal that was suggested was bear, and, there's bears in the area. Just no one in 20-plus years of camping has had any encounters with one. There was no other sign of bear, no scratch marks on trees, no footprints, no scat, no nothing. So, that just said it probably wasn't a bear, but I don't know what it was. And so, it was just one of those little mystery things filed away in my weird stuff mental file. So for people who are going out camping and they hear a sound in the woods that they don't know what is, they can compare that to sounds that are found on your website, which is bfro.net, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, as far as, besides the vocalizations, what other kinds of sounds do they make? I've heard about knocking. I've heard about actually even throwing large rocks and branches into camp at people. Have you ever had experiences like that?
Absolutely. I've had rocks thrown at me. The first time, I had branches thrown at me in North Georgia in 1999, my very first encounter. I had rocks thrown at me in 2006 in Northeast Georgia as well. And then again at a later time in 2007 in North Georgia. And then in the winter of 2007, we had rocks thrown at us in South Carolina on an expedition. And the last time it happened to me was 2 years ago in Utah on the Duchesne River in the Uinta Mountains. And that was easily the most exciting time. But they seem to throw things in order to encourage people to move along. And for the uninitiated, it absolutely works. Even for those of us that are pursuing these things, it's very difficult to sit through that and to, understand that there's really no harm intended. They're only trying to, intimidate you and encourage you into leaving. They're not trying to hurt you. They can be very dramatic and throw huge, large rocks into water. But usually when the rocks that are thrown at people or that hit people are small, like pebbles, or even pine cones, things like that. But they can certainly throw huge rocks to make a loud noise or a loud splash or a loud bang, etc. But it just tends to be this really non-confrontation. They don't step out in the open and beat their chests and roar or, curse the heavens and throw punches at people. They tend to hide in dense brush and hide behind trees and do things from those positions that are intimidating, like growl or break branches or throw branches or throw rocks. It's a very non-confrontational thing. Like, they're kind of the masters of the passive aggressive. I think they're very, very fearful of humans. So they don't put themselves in position to be, line of sight, where someone can shoot at them or shine a light at them, etc. But, I've heard the knocks many times. I have a lot of theories about that. I'm pretty good at being able to elicit knocks. I think I know why they knock. And in terms of throwing of things, you kind of have to elicit that intimidation behavior. And there are certain ways, I think, that are reliable to do that. But, I've definitely experienced those things over the years. It's few and far between. Any encounter is. I don't want people to get the impression that I go out and have encounters. It takes a lot of time and a lot of trial and error, and there's always going to be a certain degree of luck. But I've been out all over the country many times for many years and been skunked, 90% of the time, and then sometimes you get lucky and you get close. So it's certainly not a very common occurrence, even for those of us that are out there all the time.
Now, I've also been told, in fact, there was a comment in the virtual auditorium about some people taking food to leave for the Bigfoot and claiming that it is, in fact, taken and eaten. Food such as, apples, oranges, somewhat natural foods. Have you ever used bait in such a manner?
Absolutely. And I've used everything from apples, oranges, bananas to, huge bags of dog food to raw meat to bacon grease, onions, garlic, honey buns, you name it, I've used it. I do think that I always kind of laugh when I see people, they go out and they leave like one apple. And I can't take credit for this line. It was actually, I heard a female researcher from Oregon named Autumn Williams say, you should probably give them more than an apple. That's like if you went into someone's home and they said, "Are you hungry? Can I offer you a grape?" It wouldn't be very much of an offering. So, but we talk a lot about, we laugh about honey buns too, but that's something they don't get in the natural world, and certainly it's not the healthiest thing, but it's very carb rich and starch rich and sugar rich, and I think they'd react to those things more. And, I certainly don't want people to get the impression that I'm trying to harm them or cause them to eat unhealthy things. I'm trying to document them. And so I think it's more easy to elicit certain reactions because, again, I'm very convinced that they exploit human food waste in a lot of these places like campgrounds and recreation areas and parks. So I think they're getting a lot of that human junk food anyway, at least in certain places, certain Sasquatches are, and they tend to really, react to that. And I think, again, it's just a more rich payoff than what you can get in the natural world. For example, the most sugar-rich thing that you can get in North America is honey. And we all know that's not a very easy thing to get, and especially in an abundance. You suffer a lot of bee stings trying to get that, and there's very little, especially for an animal that's, 800 to 1,000 pounds, very, very large animal. So I think they probably do go after sugar-rich sources. In fact, one of my favorite witnesses in the world is a woman from North Georgia, and she owns a business, and she owns a fudge shop, and they make their own fudge and candy, etc. And they have a dumpster on their property where they live in a rural area because where they're situated in this small town, there's no room for dumpsters on Main Street. So they used to take their trash home, and their trash was like icing and fudge and peanut brittle and basically candy. And after a few years, You know, they had some odd things happen, and then she ended up seeing the Sasquatch on the property. And at that point, the previous year's oddities started to make sense. But one of the things that would happen was it would constantly take food out of the dumpster. And it would do it in a manner different than a bear. It wouldn't claw or rip open bags. It would take bags, or it would open bags with hands and eat, you know, the sugar-rich stuff. And then, so they got savvy and bought a new dumpster with metal lids with locks. And the same peeled back, these huge heavy metal lids like the top of a sardine can. And a bear, now if a bear pushes upward with its forepaws, it could dig something at an angle, but this was literally like peeled and rolled back like something with thumbs that could create a motor action, a wrenching action. So I mean, stories like that really compel me that, man, they really are connected to sugary foods. So I think you can leave apples and oranges and stuff, but they probably would pass that up for whatever's in the trash cans at those places, like potato chips and hot dogs and buns and cookies and, you know, whatever other kind of gross, disgusting human food waste there is.
Yeah. You know, in terms of using bait and game cameras, you know, in this digital age, game cameras are getting better and better every year. Has there been any luck in getting photographs with those?
Well, I'll tell you, there are some photographs that are very good that have been obtained with game cameras, but, you know, most game cameras aren't capable for this job. I mean, there's a few things. Number one, most cameras use white flash, whether it's LED flash or it's like a halogen bulb. And then the ones that don't, we use an infrared flash that's usually, you know, in the lower nanometers of IR, which most nocturnal mammals can see. And so I think Sasquatches avoid those flashing light sources. But people that pursue these things tend to, you know, like set up a bait station and surround it with cameras. And I'll tell you this, and again, you know, if I were to go into the full details of this, it would take up a whole other episode. But I'm very, very, very convinced, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Sasquatches are cooperative ambush hunters. That's how they work. That's how they operate. I think that their predatory behaviors are the most controlling behaviors. I think all the adaptations that we see, the consistencies in the modern-day Bigfoot reports are predatory adaptations, and there's, you know, that goes down to facial morphology, physical build morphology, the way, nocturnality, all these things. I don't think those are just a result of avoiding humans. I think it's because they are hunters and they're apex predators. And I think they're ambush hunters, and they work cooperatively. So if you assume for a second that I'm right, and, you know, only time will tell, and it's not my theory, I mean, many of us think this, several of us in the research community are convinced of this. If you assume that they are ambush hunters and have been for thousands of generations, and they are hardwired for that their survival mechanism is to enter terrain and move around in their home range and see places where they can ambush the prey that they seek, you know, anticipate and ambush prey, then you'd have to understand that they are hardwired to anticipate an ambush better than anything. So when a human sets up a feeble ambush, like, oh, well, I'm going to put myself here and the Bigfoot's going to walk here and I'm going to take its picture, it's not going to happen because they do not put themselves in places where they're vulnerable. They don't allow themselves to be in places where they'd be ambushed. Just like you can't put 6 cameras around a picnic table and then cover the picnic table in fish and fruit and cookies. Bigfoot's not going to come out and take that stuff. If it were that easy, we'd know a lot more about them. They'd be in our encyclopedias and we'd have hundreds of pictures and hundreds of hours of footage of them, but we don't. It's like trying to document something but always giving it the tactical advantage, because as soon as you take the tactical advantage, they avoid you, they leave. And I do think that the idea of pursuing them and putting things out in the woods, you know, that changes things. That's very invasive. It's a very active way of trying to document them. And with these things, like the second you try to study them, they change their patterns. So my focus has always been about, well, how do I document them doing what they're already doing? You know, how do you, for example, if they are raiding campgrounds occasionally, like I strongly suspect they are, that'd be a very easy way to film them if you were able to set up thermal cameras in a campground. If they think the campground is abandoned and they approach and come to take trash, well, then you get minutes of footage. rather than sitting, on a ridgeline yourself, holding a thermal camera, trying to call one in to walk by, or to encounter one. You find out, well, where are the quote-unquote Sasquatch magnets, the places they'd already be drawn to, and they're already comfortable coming around certain human objects, like if they come around homesteads occasionally. I think that if you put cameras in a campground or on a homestead, they wouldn't, a man-made object among other man-made objects wouldn't seem very foreign. But yeah, these guys that put game cameras out in the woods and bait piles, it's too much of an ambush. And I guarantee you, believe me, you don't have to take my word for it. You can believe me or not, but I think these things are far too smart for that, and they will never put themselves in a position to be ambushed, whether by person or by camera or whatever. If it looks like an ambush, they won't go near it. And they can detect an ambush better than any other animal on the continent.
Well, I think I agree with you. It does make absolute sense to set up these cameras in a campground or around a homestead where it's believed that they are frequenting. Like the woman who had the fudge shop and was having her dumpster assaulted. That would be an excellent place to put the camera.
Absolutely. And by the time she saw the thing and reacted to it, it knew it had been spotted, and the activity ceased. And it really does seem like whenever they know they've been seen in a place, they leave it for a while. For example, in Bluff Creek, after Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin encountered the female Sasquatch there and filmed it, that was a broad daylight standoff encounter. Bob Gimlin aimed his .30-06 at the thing. It's a very, tense standoff. The tracks had been found in Bluff Creek since 1958. And after that, they were gone, and a lot of people went back in that drainage with cameras and guns, and no one ever got more footage, and no one ever brought a body out of there. And that's the nature of Bigfoot research, is someone sees one somewhere, and people go there to try to film it, and it never happens. So I do think that they will, if there's some kind of an encounter or confrontation that's negative, they'll just leave the area for a while, or rather they'll be a lot more savvy. They're smart enough to know, well, humans now realize I'm here, et cetera, but you will see, it's really not my place to talk about some of this stuff, but there are footages that have been filmed in these scenarios of where Sasquatches are frequenting homesteads or exploiting human food, and they have been filmed in those circumstances, and it's not my project, and hopefully it will be, released sooner than later, and that will be something everyone will get to see. But I do think that's a much more viable strategy of getting footage and documenting these things than to go out and pursue them. It's a lot of fun to go out and pursue them, and I love being in wild places, and I love listening in the dark, and I love, making sounds and getting responses. It's just very difficult to document those situations because they're extremely unpredictable. And, these things are very difficult to locate and to predict and to pursue. But I do think that there are places where they're already, habituated to a certain type of behavior or a certain type of lifestyle, and those are the opportunities we have to document them. But again, it's difficult, but I think it's a more viable strategy than the alternative.
Well, I'm listening to you talking, and I'm thinking about the area in Florida where we go camping and where sounds have been heard, not only by me, but by other people, and other things that make you question whether or not they're in the area. It's almost like describing the perfect place. It's heavily forested, but it's at the edge of human habitation. There's homesteads all along the main roads. People go in that area and camp a lot. There are numerous creeks. There's a lot of natural foods in the area, too. Blueberries, huckleberries, all sorts of things. There's fish in the creek, of course. There's deer. There's rabbits. There's a fair amount of wildlife. It's almost, if they are somewhat gathering food from leavings from humans, because it's primitive camping. Now, granted, we leave a clean camp, but we've often arrived, and the previous one sure as heck didn't. So people do leave food behind, and trash and other stuff. It's not uncommon. So I could easily see where they are becoming accustomed to people being there, and that knowing that when they leave, they're apt to leave food behind.
Certainly.
Yeah. And we are winding down towards the end of the program. Real quick, can you tell me what made you start pursuing information about Bigfoot?
I had an encounter in the summer of 1999, which is actually, we have the whole thing on video, myself and the people I was with, and there's not much to be seen, but there's a lot of sounds to be heard on that tape. It was very late at night, and it was in the northeast Georgia mountains. And for a long time, we didn't know what had happened. We knew that we encountered something in the woods that was very, it was intimidating, it was acting hostile and aggressive, etc. I stumbled upon some Bigfoot information later and thought, well, I'm not certain if I think these things exist. And I started truly, I thought, well, if these things are around in this part of Georgia, then they have to have been here for a long time. So I started kind of from as far back in time as I could look with Cherokee, Native American lore and Creek Native American lore, and into the the first accounts of European settlers and explorers, and I found confirmation of people encountering these animals and describing these animals as far back as you can look in time in North Georgia. I mean, for example, in old newspaper articles, I have 37 articles that predate the year 1900 of people seeing these things, and they're described, 8 to 10 feet tall, covered head to toe in jet black or brown hair with disproportionately long arms, and they make certain sounds when they're nocturnal. I mean, they're absolutely seeing the same things that people report now, and this is before, the word Bigfoot was coined in 1958, and the word Sasquatch was coined in 1929, and this is way before that, way before the advent of the idea of these things. People were seeing them in North Georgia, and that's when I knew that they were real, and that what I encountered was, 2 of these animals at night, and I decided to get involved in field research and met just nothing but mostly incredible people and formed some amazing relationships and had some incredible experiences and have been learning and working hard for years since. So that was really the impetus into that.
Great. Well, Matt, I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. It has been fantastic, as always. And, folks, I hope everyone has enjoyed the program as much as I have, as well as that you found it provided you all with plenty of food for thought and more illumination for your personal journey towards truth. Join us again next Tuesday, and we'll bring you along for another episode of The Dawn of Shades, and I am sure that it's going to be another fascinating conversation as well. With that, we are out of time. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and good night.
The Church of Mabus radio show is now in session, Saturday nights at 11 p.m. Eastern, with high-strange scholars teaching us of ufology, the paranormal, and the occult, and the metaphysical. Seek sanctuary.